So with that being said, now, like I said, for the rest of this lesson and next lesson, I want to talk specifically about the setting, the content, the context, the setting and dating of the book of Revelation. We want to really downpack that. Like I said, if we do this well, if we address the question of when the book of Revelation was written, if we address that well, this will help us interpret the book of Revelation as it was intended to be. So the dating of the book of Revelation is extremely important. So please don't get frustrated if you feel that, why are we going into this much detail? Why don't we just go back to our exegesis? We will do plenty of exegesis, but I just want to stress the fact that just like early on, I emphasized some of those foundational questions like the genre of Revelation and how we are to understand those signs and symbols in light of how the first century culture understood those signs and symbols rather than how our culture understands it. Just bear with me. You don't need to take in all this information. Just try to understand the big picture. It's like in kindergarten year 1, how we do that hard work of learning our alphabet and basic arithmetic so that as we grow, we can expand ourselves and learn deeper mathematics and deeper vocabulary. We want to do that here. We want to get some of this foundational stuff right. But I hope in the process of doing that, you'll also learn and grow with what I have to say. So let's turn our attention to these questions of context and dating of the book of Revelation, because dating the book of Revelation can impact how we understand, how we interpret the book of Revelation. So like I said, I'm just giving you a general picture of what's going on, the big picture of what's going on in the Roman world. Can everyone see this particular spreadsheet? You don't need to care about all this detail. You don't need to bring it in. Just sit back, enjoy. Like I said, I'll be sending everybody my presentations. All of this information will be eventually on YouTube. We have videos dedicated to this. Sit back and enjoy. You don't need to know these things in detail. I'm probably going to give you more detail over the next week and a half than you care. If you care about this information, then you are like me and you desperately need a life. Okay, if you care about this information, that's all I'm going to say to you. So just sit back and relax. Okay, as I say to people, I don't need to know the different octaves to appreciate the music. Okay, to appreciate the voice of Elvis. I don't need to know the fact that he could sing in all 8 octaves. Okay, unless I need a life, unless I'm interested in the subject, I'll spend all my life trying to understand what those 8 octaves are, or I'll just appreciate it. Okay, so don't be like me. Don't waste your time reading, Tacitus or reading Josephus or Plutarch or whoever. Just enjoy. Okay, so we know that Rome had 12 Caesars. The first century Roman culture was so important. The Bible says that in the fullness of time, Christ came. And what was the big picture historical context going on for the 50 odd years before the life of Christ and then the first century context? Okay, so we know that Rome had 12 Caesars, and there are the pictures there. This is somebody was very, very fortunate, and they happened to have an iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy fully charged in that day, and they happened to take a picture of what these men actually looked like. There were a lot of Caesars, but there were Roman historian Suetonius wrote a book called The 12 Caesars. Okay, now there was actually 11 Caesars. Augustus was technically the first Caesar. And Julius Caesar, although his last name, the name Caesar is a last name. Julius Caesar. Caesar was his name, and that name became a title to refer to the emperor. So Julius Caesar wasn't technically an emperor, but most people regarded him as kind of like the first emperor because he was really the one who set it all up. They didn't have a category for emperor because Rome had been a republic for so long that They gave it to him. Okay, so we recognize some of these names. Most of you would know who Julius Caesar was. You would have heard of him. Where have we heard of Augustus from? Which story in the Bible have we heard of Augustus from? Oh, no. Goodness me. There's a famous story in the life of Jesus where Caesar Augustus is mentioned. Does anybody remember what it was? There's wrong answers, but there's no judgmental answers if you get it wrong. Luke's gospel, Luke chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus decreed that a census should be taken. So that's where Caesar Augustus is mentioned from. Tiberius, he is the Caesar who was alive, who was on the throne in Rome for the majority of Jesus's, all of Jesus's ministry, which took place. Caligula, the man who made his senator a horse. He didn't make his senator a horse. He made his horse a senator. The other way around. You can't make a senator a horse. You can make a horse a senator. We have Nero, who we have heard of there. We have then Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Okay, like I said, unless you do not have a life, you don't need to care about any of this information. Okay, just sit back and enjoy what is going on at this particular time. Okay, so just a big picture of what happened there. So in 49 BC, so for centuries, so Rome had kings in the past, but for centuries they had been ruled by the republic, by the Senate who had ruled, the sort of sharing of powers. Don't think of democracy as we have it today, but it was a sort of sharing of powers amongst sort of the high-class males who dominated the ancient world, who were able to sort of occupy power in the Roman Senate. So Julius Caesar in 49 BC, he does something unthinkable. He's amassed a lot of power, and the Senate start to get worried about him because he's a brilliant tactician in the battlefield, and he's got a lot of wealth and a lot of power. He crosses the Rubicon, which is like a sort of small river, which was considered, once you crossed that river, you were entering into Rome properly. He was sent a decree by the Senate, ordered to sort of give up his power. I'm summarizing here. He refused to do it. He crossed the Rubicon, so he crossed his army into Rome, and from that point on, it was considered a declaration of war. He was at war with the Senate. Rome went into a huge civil war, and Caesar was eventually victorious in 45 BC. He overcame the man who was sent by the Senate to defeat him, a man by the name of Pompey. He defeated him in 45, he sort of became dictator, sort of the first de facto Caesar. In 44, he was assassinated by the man who was known to commit the greatest act of treason, Brutus, up until Judas, who betrayed Christ. Now, when we think about traitor, we think about Judas. Even Benedict Arnold hasn't been able to usurp Judas for that throne. That when people think of traitors, Judas is the chief most traitor of all time. So he's assassinated. Another war breaks out in 44 BC. Eventually, a man by the name of Octavian in 31 BC defeats somebody who you've probably heard. His name was Mark Antony. He defeats him at a famous battle called the Battle of Actium. Mark Antony, who was one of Caesar's chief men. So Caesar had his army. Mark Antony was one of his key generals. So Octavian defeats Mark Antony. Octavian was an adopted son, one of Caesar's adopted sons. So he and one of Caesar's generals, Mark Antony, have a war. Octavian is successful at the Battle of Actium, and Mark Antony commits suicide with his lover, Elizabeth Taylor, who is more truthfully known as Cleopatra. So in 31 BC, Octavian becomes the most powerful man. He wins the civil war in 27 BC. He basically he's an astute politician. So he knows that he needs the Senate to end the civil war and to sort of consolidate his power. He gives them a lot of responsibility and a lot of rights. He restores sort of the republic under this guise. Although he's set up as Caesar, they give him the title Augustus. Augustus means worthy of admiration, honor, worship, Augustus. So hence the title Caesar Augustus. So Caesar is the ruler at the time of Christ's birth. And Augustus really took Rome to huge heights. This is where they accrued a lot of wealth, and the empire really built. He built roads and transportation systems. He consolidated power, and he restored what is known as the Pax Romana, which is the peace of Rome, which comes by the rule of the Caesar. So we know that in the book of Colossians, chapter 4, it talks about that when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law so that we might become his adopted sons. That's in Rome. That's in Galatians chapter 4. So what is this in the fullness of time? Well, Augustus becoming the Caesar revolutionized the empire, built roads and transportations, and really connected the empire. So when the early Christians went out preaching the gospel message, they were able to do this because of what Caesar Augustus had achieved when he came into power. And there was no longer any civil war. Finally, the Senate and the king worked together to actually restore and keep the peace and the Pax Romana. When the Bible talks about Jesus as the Prince of Peace, what does the book of Luke start off with? This notion of, in those days, Caesar Augustus declared a census, and what do the angels declare? Peace is what they declare. Peace on earth to those on whom God's favor rests. And this is what Jesus is, the one who brings the true Pax Romana, the true peace. There's a lot going on in the world at this time, and a lot of people who were sort of vying for power at this time. King Herod was actually installed as king of the Jews around this time in 36 BC. He went to the Senate and they gave him the authority as king of the Jews. He dies in 4 BC. Now we look at that little arrow there which says 4 to 6 BC. Christ is born. Christ is born. Well, we know that the calendar was arranged around the birth of Christ. BC, before Christ, AD, which is sort of this phrase which means in the year of the Lord. And we ask the question, well, how is Christ born in 4 years before year 0? So it doesn't make sense. Anno Domini is the word, Anno Domini, and it means in the year of our Lord. Well, shouldn't Jesus have been born in the year 0? Okay, the Bible says that King Herod was obviously alive when Jesus was born. We remember in Matthew's gospel, it talks about how Herod wanted to kill Christ, and he massacres infants in Bethlehem who are under the age of 2. Really quickly, quick background. There was never a centralized calendar in the ancient world. There was never a centralized calendar. The Romans had one calendar. Parthians had their own calendar. The Egyptians had their own chronology and their own calendar. Everyone had different calendars, okay? Eventually, monks, when the Roman Catholic Church came to power in the Middle Ages, decided we need to have a centralized calendar. What typically happened in the ancient world is one king came to power, so that became a new year. That king lasted for so long. Once they died, a new king came to power, so a new dating system started with that new king. These monks and these religious officials decided we need one sort of centralized dating system to be able to piece everything together. Imagine without a calendar. We know we live in 2023. Imagine without a calendar trying to piece everything together just with bits and pieces of historical data. So with details about the First World War, the Second World War, the shipping of the sinking of the Titanic. It's not easy to centralize the chronology of the world, and some of these monks had a really difficult time doing that. You're also reliant on ancient authors getting all of their dates correct, which they wouldn't have done that. So the monk that tried to accurately predict the year that Christ was born, he did a really, really admirable job. He got really, really close. He was just a few years off. He was about 4 years off. So instead of being in the year 2023, we're actually probably in the year 2027. The reason why he was a couple of years off is, remember I said there, Octavian came to power in 31 BC. In 27 BC, he was given the name Caesar Augustus. That means he ruled for 4 years under his old name, Octavian, before taking up the name Augustus. Bang. That's basically the 4 years why there was a bit of an error there, okay? Not 100% sure that that's the case, but that's the most convincing theory that we have there, okay? So that's basically what's going on there. Rome obviously had Herod installed as king. After Herod died, they didn't really trust the people that Herod left, his descendants. So they sort of put in place a governor, and we know the most famous governor, Pontius Pilate. Between AD 30 and AD 33, Jesus dies, which means he's probably somewhere in his mid to late 30s by the time he dies. At that particular point, Tiberius was still in power. Caligula comes along, Claudius comes along. It's between these guys' eras that the church starts to expand. Any questions or any comments that people want to make? Is this, again, unless you have a life, you don't need to know all of these details. I'm just trying to give you the lay of the land here so we understand what's going on, okay? Any questions or comments people have here? Okay, so we know we've spoken about Nero comes to power. I'm going to have a bit to say about Nero in a little bit in a few moments' time. Nero comes to power in 54 AD. There's a great fire in Rome, which for the first time, Christians have been persecuted sort of in a local sense by basically the Jewish authorities who kicked them out of synagogue, and a few of them, like James, had been killed. And we know that Revelation mentions one of these guys by name who was killed at this time as well. So it's this time. You see that line there. There's at this time, there are a minority group of scholars who believe it is at this time the book of Revelation is written. So Nero starts to persecute Christians. Some of this persecution extends to the regions of Asia Minor that we've looked at, these 7 churches who were pretty loyal to the emperor, and some of them started to persecute local Christians. It said at this time John was exiled in Patmos, okay? It's at this time that some scholars, a minority of scholars, a robust group of scholars. So even though they're in the minority, there are some pretty world-renowned, highly regarded scholars who actually fall into this category where they believe that the book of Revelation, that John is exiled at some point during the reign of Nero, and it's at this point that Revelation is written and addressed to the churches. The Gospels are being written around this time. We don't know the exact date the Gospels were written, but they were written around this time or just after 70 AD, they may have been written, okay? The majority view is down the bottom there, that Revelation was written in the mid-90s. Most scholars fall into this category. The reason why this is important is because of what happens in 66 to 70 AD. Okay, you notice there I've got those green arrows there. In 66 to 70 AD, the Jewish people revolt against the Roman authorities. There's a lot of corruption and a lot of debate going on in Israel, in Jerusalem at this time, between individuals who want to get rid of the Romans and individuals who just want to practice Judaism, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they want to sort of blend with the empire. These two groups butt head. Eventually, this leads to a civil war, and the Jewish people in Jerusalem sort of kick out the Romans, and they have some early successes. Rome tries to put down the rebellion, but the Jews have successes and they drive them back. The Emperor Nero sends Vespasian to Jerusalem in order to bring the revolt under control. Vespasian goes from the north, from Galilee, and it is a bloodbath as he makes his way down into Jerusalem. It's just a bloodbath from Galilee down to Jerusalem. People execute. The revolt is put down violently. Vespasian goes to Jerusalem and he puts it under siege. But unfortunately, Nero commits suicide around this time. This throws the whole Roman world into chaos. The whole world is chaotic here at this particular point. You will remember those last year who did Matthew's Gospel. We talked in detail at an event called the Olivet Discourse, okay? The Olivet Discourse was a sermon that Jesus gave in the final week of his life. You can go and you can read it. It appears in Matthew's Gospel, Luke's Gospel, Mark's Gospel. Jesus is in the temple. The disciples are marveling at the temple building, and they ask Jesus for his opinion. Jesus says to the people that within a generation, not one stone will be left standing. Jesus dies around 33 AD, and he says within a generation, not one stone will be left standing. He then gives a long message about some of the trouble that is going to happen to the people, which will culminate in the destruction of this particular temple. I'm just repeating, those of you who did Parkside Thursdays, you will know this like the back of your hand because we looked at this in detail, okay? He then talks about how the temple will be destroyed, and then he says that about the day or the hour that I return, no one knows, okay? But the details here between 60 and 70 AD is when these things were fulfilled. The things that Christ had predicted were fulfilled. And it culminates, so Nero commits suicide. Then there is what is called the year of the four emperors. Caesar commits suicide. Galba survives for only a little while. Otho survives for a little while. Vitellius survives for a little while. Vespasian, because of all the chaos going on in the world, and remember, Christ says, you will hear of, in this Olivet Discourse, he says, you will hear of wars, rumors of wars. The suffering here will be suffering that the world has never seen before. There will be earthquakes, famine. The Roman world was thrown into chaos at this particular time. It was chaos. There was so much devastation, so much destructions, earthquakes, wars, civil war. Everything was just crazy going on in the world at this particular time. Vespasian leaves the campaign that he has. He leaves the campaign in 70 AD. He restores power by taking advantage and becoming emperor. And then suddenly there's a bit of restoration. He sends his son Titus to finish the job. Titus comes in April 70 AD, puts Jerusalem under siege. Jerusalem had enough food to last them for about 5 years. A group of people in Jerusalem known as the Zealots, you would have heard about one of these Zealots, Judas, who wanted war with Rome, wanted to try to force the hand of the people to amass an army and march against Rome. They burned the grain supply. That means there's no food in the city, there's no food coming in. This led to a massive famine. It was chaotic, 5 months. It was exactly as Jesus described. The suffering would be terrible in the nation of Israel at this particular time. Bloodbaths, famine, mothers feeding their children, resorting to cannibalism of their own children in order to survive. Josephus gives us horrific details. The only group of people who avoided this tremendous suffering was a group of people known as Christians. Because when Christ gave the Olivet Discourse, he warned the Christians. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out. You can't get out if a city is surrounded by armies under siege, you can't get out unless those armies leave temporarily. That's exactly what happened Vespasian and those who originally tried to take Jerusalem left. So the Christians, hearing Jesus' word, got out of the cities. They fled to the mountains. They fled so that they got past, they survived the destruction. In the space of 5 months of putting Jerusalem under siege, Jerusalem had its own water supply. It had its own food supply. It lasted only 5 months because the city's food supply was burnt by the zealots. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. Rome marched on the temple. It was destroyed. Even Titus could not believe the destruction that came about. And from that point on, Jews have been spread out into what we call the diaspora. Jews were spread out all around the world. And what happened after the Second World War? The nation of Israel was restored for the first time in 2,000 odd years, and the Jewish people finally had a homeland again. Okay? So this is why the date of the book of Revelation is so important. If the book of Revelation is written in the mid-60s, as the minority of scholars argue, then what primarily is the book of Revelation talking about? Well, the book of Revelation primarily is talking about the destruction of the temple. When Jesus in the book of Revelation says, "Yes, I am coming soon," when he says to the church that the time is near, what is the coming of the Lord talking about? It is talking about the destruction of the temple. If, however, the book of Revelation, as the majority of scholars says, is talking about things which happened in the 90s through Domitian's reign, then perhaps the book of Revelation is talking about different things. Now, next week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the reign of, I'm going to spend some time, just 10 quick minutes, talking about Nero's reign. Then I'm going to talk next week about Domitian's reign and the arguments for and against the dating of the book of Revelation. As I said, a lot of this you won't care about. I'm just trying to build some solid building and foundation blocks which will help us. Now, I made a serious error of judgment at the start of this particular teaching. When I talked about the dating of the book of Revelation, week 2, I mentioned that the majority of scholars fall in the 90s and a minority of scholars fall in the mid-60s. And I said, I'm agnostic to the dating of the book of Revelation. And I said, I lean towards the mid-90s. That is not possible. That is not possible. We really can't be agnostic. The more and more that I've studied the book of Revelation in order to teach it to you, I've actually changed my view. I've actually changed my view. Do you know, let me just describe this to you. You know, when we think about the House of Parliament, our House of Representatives, the Green House, the lower house in federal parliament, how we have 150 seats, and we know there's the minority, those that didn't get government, which at the moment are the Liberal Party, and then there's the majority, the Labour Party, who have the majority, and then there's a group of people in the middle, the crossbenchers, the independents. You know, I tried to sit on the crossbench. I tried to say that I'm an independent who leans more towards the majority view. I've studied the book of Revelation as much as possible to try to teach this to everybody. A few days ago, I read the book of Revelation in one hit to try to come to a conclusion. I have now changed camps. I now sit on the edge of the minority view. There are well-respected scholars who I love dearly. One of them is Craig Keener, who you know, I have really regarded as one of the greatest scholars that has studied the New Testament. I've met him. He's in the majority view that the Bible, that it was written in the mid-90s. There are a lot of scholars who I respect. I wouldn't be able to argue them because they're brilliant men, but I find myself in the minority view. There are some really great, robust scholars who fall into this category, but I do stress that it is the minority view. Next week, I will talk about the majority, about the mid-90s, the evidence for the later date, and the evidence for the mid-60s, the earlier date, and why I have come to this conclusion. And from that position, I will teach the rest of the book of Revelation. But as I said, your actual dating, doesn't actually matter. The themes of the book of Revelation can actually sort of fold through. Just quickly to finish up today, just give me 10 more minutes. I just want to talk about Nero. What's going on in Nero's day? There he is. Somebody with their camera phone snapped a picture of Nero. So Nero was born into the right family tree. His uncle was Caligula, who we just said was one of the emperors, the emperor who made his horse a senator. That Caligula was his uncle. His mother, Agrippina the younger, was the great-grandchild of Caesar Augustus, which makes Nero, by ipso facto, the great-great-grandchild of Augustus. So he was born into the right family line. The Emperor Claudius, who was the emperor before him, Agrippina, his mother, married Claudius. So Nero was adopted by Claudius. There is some Claudius didn't really think that Nero was suitable. He was sort of an odd kid growing up, and Claudius had his own son, whose name was Britannicus. He had his own son, Britannicus, who he sort of thought was a better suit for the heir apparent. But through some good political maneuvering, Agrippina managed to convince Claudius to name Nero as his successor. Now, Agrippina poisoned her husband. She poisoned Claudius, gave him a concoction of poison. He drank it, and at the age of 16, Nero became president, prime minister, king, ruler, emperor. At the age of 16, his early years as emperor, as any 16-year-old would probably be at the crown at that age, was pretty uneventful. He spent most of his time getting up to mischief, vandalizing shops in the street with his mates. When the police tried to arrest him, he showed off and said, "Hey, it's me," and they couldn't do anything. Pretty much imagine what I would do if I was king. I'd go around vandalizing and nobody could do anything about it. That's pretty much what happens. It ain't like today where the royal officials get into trouble. They post something, they wear a Nazi outfit, and everyone thinks foolish of them, makes fun of them. No, Nero pretty much does that at age 16. So who was running the empire while he was getting up to mischief? Basically, his mother, Agrippina, a man by the name of Seneca, who was actually quite a level-headed guy, and a guy by the name of Burrus, who was basically a military guy. They were running the emperor at this particular point. Nero poisoned his stepbrother Britannicus because he didn't want to risk sharing the throne with anybody. Poisoned him in a very clever strategy. He poisoned him during their mealtime. The problem was that people were pretty astute to the fact that people would try poisoning each other every now and again. So they would have a cupbearer who would drink the drink first. Nero, in order to get around this, they made the drink really, really hot, boiling hot. So the cupbearer drinks the drink and realizes, I'm not dead, it's not poisonous. Britannicus tries to drink the drink and realizes, oh, it's too hot, it needs to cool down. It's at this point, while it's cooling, somebody slips some poison into the glass and Britannicus is dead pretty quickly. He has what looks like an epileptic fit. So Nero is sitting back while Britannicus is sort of rolling around, convulsing, and says, "Oh, don't worry, he's just having an epileptic fit," when in truth, he was actually dying at this point. Nero was a bit of an oddball. He was a bit of an artsy individual. He loved arts. He loved carving. He loved singing. He loved performing, playing music. He would have these long music sessions where he would perform at the theater and he would make people watch for hours and hours, and they weren't allowed to leave whilst he performed. So much so that Tacitus, the historian Tacitus, tells us that women gave birth while he was doing his long particular performance there. I won't allow anybody to make any jokes about my preaching here. We will move on. Over time, people started to realize he was a madman, and he lived an immoral lifestyle. You know, he had these parties where there were prostitutes and just all sorts of immorality. It's too vulgar for us to actually go in. He basically was he was most likely a homosexual, and he had maybe homosexual tendencies, and he married somebody in the public sphere. He basically took on the role of the bride and got married to another man. It was just, when you read about this, even for Roman standards, some of the historians describe some of his ghastly immorality just as crazy and just vulgar. displays of sensuality and sexuality in the marketplace, and people were just sort of were really turned off at this particular point. Eventually, even his own mother sort of realized that Nero is just not the right person for the job. So what do you do when your own mother doesn't think you're the right person for the job? Well, you have her assassinated. He developed, she was wise to the fact that Nero was going to try to bump her off at this point. So he delivered, he orchestrated an elaborate sort of ploy. First, he tried to have her bumped off through shipwreck. He basically, what's the word I'm looking for? He tampered with her boat. And one day when she was she had attended one of his elaborate public celebrations, the boat started to sink. It sort of collapsed. The roof collapsed and the boat started to sink. She was quite a strong woman. She swam to the shoreline. Eventually, Nero tried again and just gave up and had his mum stabbed. She's reported to have said famously when the guards were there to stab her, "Stab me in the womb," she basically says, because I gave birth to this monster, is what she sort of said, that my womb produced this monster, and she was stabbed there. The only real sort of, well, probably the most notorious event of his life was the fire of AD 64, which we've spoken about here, which could perhaps give rise to, as I've said, the early dating for the book of Revelation. In AD 64, there's a great fire in Rome. Two-thirds of the city is destroyed. About one sort of fourth is completely decimated. Rome was divided into about 10 different blocks. About 4 of these blocks were devastated completely. 3 of these blocks were devastated completely. 4 of them suffered significant damage. Nero came in, swooped in, and at first he was very charitable. He lowered the price of grain to sort of get food out there. He opened up his courts and everything, so his grounds, so that people could have sanctuary whilst they put out the fire. And he was very charitable at first. The problem was very, very quickly. You know how politicians can be really dumb sometimes? Well, Nero very quickly threw out plans for the rebuilding of a new city, which he called Neropolis. The fire lasted for about 2 weeks, just around 2 weeks' time. Within a few days, he pulled out these plans. People started to scratch their head and say, why does he have new plans, architecturally drawn out plans for a new city? They put 2 and 2 together. They realized he must have had something to do with the burning of the city. So blame was fastened on him. To escape the blame, he blamed it on Christians. And this is what Tacitus, the historian, says to us in the yellow. Consequently, to get rid of the report, so the blame that people were putting on him, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite. Now, notice he says the most exquisite of tortures, because he didn't like the Christians. The most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, it was just the Roman way of referring to Christ, or the Roman spelling of Christ. Christus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty. What was the extreme penalty? Crucifixion during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And the most mischievous superstition. What's the most mischievous superstition? The resurrection. Thus, checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and became popular. All he's really saying is that Pontius Pilate had Christ executed. The superstition that the Christ were preaching, he doesn't name it. We know what the Christ were preaching. It was the resurrection from the dead. Broke out first in Judea, then Samaria, then to the ends of the earth as they went about preaching the gospel. It finds its way to Rome. And this is what he says. It says that accordingly, this is Nero, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. So all who would not renounce their Christian faith. Then upon their information, an immense multitude were convicted, not so much for the crime of firing the city, because everyone knew they didn't burn the city, but for what? Their hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their debts. Covered with the skin of beast, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses. The Colosseum hadn't been built yet. Christians were executed in the Colosseum. That was at later time, not at this particular time. They were torn apart by wild dogs, nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one's man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. So all that Tacitus was saying is that the people were happy that Christians were being executed. They loved the fact that they suffered extreme torture and that they were being crucified. But what Tacitus says is that even after a while, some of the public started to scratch their head and say, maybe enough is enough. They haven't actually committed this crime, so maybe enough is enough. Nero had Christians burnt alive. He had them, burnt alive in his garden. Imagine how terrible it is. It's probably most likely at this time that people like Peter and Paul died. John is probably exiled, if the early date is correct, at this particular time. So we can imagine this is the reason why Nero is described as the beast, because the suffering, the persecution, it was short. It lasts, no persecution to the people who were there is ever short, but it was short. It was mainly concentrated in Rome, but it would have extended to the other parts of the empire, because as Tacitus tells us, the Christians were despised. The Christians were hated. So, the persecution that was in Rome would have expanded at this particular time, and it was just horrendous suffering for Christians. So that is the life of Nero. So if the early date, as I will postulate next week, is correct, this is sort of the persecution that the Christians are enduring, and it will only get worse eventually when obviously the temple is destroyed. So does any questions or comments anyone wants to make there? I'm sorry I went over time there, but like I said, we just want to, next week I'll do some work about Domitian, and I'll talk about the dating. Are there any questions or comments that anybody wants to make at this particular point? Or okay, so just giving a bit of a lay of landscape when it comes to Domitian. Once again, we noticed that somebody had a very sophisticated Samsung Galaxy or an iPhone at the time, and they were able to take a bit of a selfie with the emperor there. There's a picture of him there. So Domitian, his reign is from 81 to 96. Now, Domitian lived in the shadow of his father Vespasian and his brother Titus. Both were well-renowned commanders. Obviously, Vespasian had a huge lot, had quite a fair bit of success leading part of Rome's army. Titus had successfully put down the revolt in Jerusalem. So nobody really paid attention to Domitian. Vespasian's reign, which as we mentioned lasted around 10 years, after his father died, Titus, his brother, was actually put in charge. But Titus died quite abruptly after only 2 years in power, and Titus became emperor. Titus was a devout worshipper of idols. He was devout in his worship of the Roman pantheons. But what is remarkable about Titus is that the Roman empires, the Roman emperors, the Roman Caesars varied in terms of how they set themselves up, in terms of how they regarded themselves, in terms of their deity, or how they wanted people to regard them. Vespasian didn't really have any ambition for people to regard him as a godlike figure. Even though they did, he didn't really have any overt desire to be regarded as a godlike figure. Domitian, on the other hand, set himself up as master and God, which is interesting, isn't it? That when we think about the book of Revelation, if there was a context for the book of Revelation to be written, imagine a community which is opposing Domitian, the person who's trying to set himself up as a god on earth. It makes logical sense, right? So he sets himself up as Lord, as master and God. In Ephesus, where his temple was built, it was said that he had a massive statue, a colossus statue, a statue sort of rivaling the statue of Zeus at Olympia in its glory days. That Domitian had this massive statue of himself set up. So he really did see himself as a godlike figure. The trouble with Domitian's reign is that it's a little bit hard to determine what is exactly authentic and what is inauthentic about his reign. The reason is that, and we're going to elaborate on why this was the case, but the people that have documented details about his life, people like Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, hated him. They really despised him. During his reign, he operated as a dictator. He significantly reduced the power of the Roman Senate, something which Rome did not try to do. Even figures like Augustus and the like, they tried to at least have the Senate there as some sort of accountability group there. But Domitian really got rid of the Senate, and he persecuted and he executed a bunch of them. So he was a true dictator, which means after his life, those who came back to power had lost a lot of their good friends and family. And for this reason, they wrote scathing commentaries about him in their histories. But he was a hands-on emperor. He was a hands-on emperor. Because Rome was in the process of rebuilding, he invested heavily in infrastructure. He built at least 50 different projects, and he either begun or completed 50 different projects, including the temple to his father Vespasian, the Colosseum, which is now the most iconic symbol in Rome today, a temple to Jupiter, and a number of other public places, including the Forum. So this really helped rebuild Rome after the terrible fires. Rome had been devastated by a series of fires. The most important one was the one in 64 AD during the time of Nero. He also, and this is probably one of the good things that he did, he enacted a number of reforms to try to reduce corruption and nepotism amongst high-ranking officials. So typically in Rome, the emperors set themselves up and gave jobs to the boys, basically, jobs to their family members. He sought to eradicate a lot of that, which is probably one of the good things that he is regarded for. He was very popular amongst the people because he hosted a lot of lavish banquets in the public square, a lot of public banquets, also a lot of games and the like. We know that obviously, and this makes sense because the Colosseum was completed during his reign, but we imagine like the Olympic Games. People tend to be pretty pro their country and pretty pro the government during the Olympic Games when they bid and they successfully win Olympic Games, right? And this is true. He hosted a number of lavish banquets and a number of gladiatorial games, which made him quite popular amongst the local people. Domitian, unlike some of his predecessors, he stayed pretty scandal-free. And he did try to he tried to sort of reduce the amount of immorality in the empire unsuccessfully. His only real scandal came at the hands of his lover. His lover was said to be, his wife was in an alleged affair, and he executed the person who his wife was having the affair with. And then he himself began a relationship with his niece, as you do for some reason. So that was his biggest Achilles heel. Persecution during Domitian's reign is not easy to ascertain. There was some persecution during Domitian's reign. There is some of it. It doesn't seem to be, I mean, all persecution is intense and all persecution is brutal, but it doesn't seem to be widespread persecution. It seems to be very much contained. Domitian had some really horrible policies and sanctions against the Jews, which makes sense. The Jews were hated after the revolt in 70 AD. He had some pretty harsh sanctions against the Jews, and it seems that this extended towards the Christians because he was nationalistic, because he was really devoted to the Roman pantheon. He persecuted anybody who would not submit to the Roman pantheon, and this included the Christians. Christians were actually known as atheists. Even Jews were known as atheists by the Romans. Why? Because they didn't worship many gods. So it's interesting today that people talk about atheists as people who don't believe in God, in a God. But in this particular time, to be an atheist meant that you didn't worship the Roman gods, or you only had one God, as the Jews and Christians did. There's some evidence of some high-ranking officials, Flavius Clemens and his wife, who were most likely Christians, were executed during this time. There's some documentation from the church in Rome addressed to the church in Corinth, which talks about some unexpected evils which have come upon them. So it seems though that persecution of Christians grew exponentially in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but there was certainly persecution against Christians before the time of Constantine. For several hundred years, it looked like persecution came in dribs and drabs. It was intense for a period, and then there was a bit of peace. It was intense for a period, then there was a bit of peace. Some periods were worse than others. Some emperors were worse than others, but there was some persecution during the time of Domitian. This picture here is of the famous Ark of Titus in Rome. This ark was built to commemorate Titus's victory over the Jews, in the fact that he had quashed the Jewish revolt. This arch and the inscription was built there. Domitian had some pretty laughable military campaigns during his time. He had some ludicrous military campaigns. His only real successes were really bullying campaigns where he picked on people for no reason. He had some really just baffling black eye military campaigns, which left Rome humiliated. They had to sort of settle for an odd peace treaty at one point with one region in their empire, and it took a long time, for several decades, for Rome to really recover from this black eye. Though for some reason he was still very popular amongst the military. The people that kept you in power in the Roman time were really 3 groups: the populace, so the general population, the military, and the Senate. As long as you maintained and you kept really at least 2 out of 3 happy, you were pretty good. So Domitian sort of kept the military happy and also the populace happy. But the really horrific part of his reign was really the second part of his reign. During the second part of his reign, he began a large-scale purge of the Roman Senate. It was his second part of his reign was polluted with just terrible acts of violence, bloodshed, kangaroo courts, and a lot of senators and high-ranking officials, both current serving officials and even retired officials, were executed. And it was just he just went on a massive purge, on the scale of Stalin's purges during the period between the 2 wars. So it was for this reason that he was notorious. He executed just with terrible bloodshed, most of the time on trumped up charges, Roman senators, and for this reason he was really known and really widely rejected. After he was assassinated in his own palace through really a conspiracy, and they managed to get rid of him. He was stabbed in his own palace. After 68 AD, so notorious had his tyrannical reign, so dictatorial and tyrannical had his reign been, that the Roman Senate declared that his name be removed from history. So what they did was they erased his name from history. There are building monuments which originally had his inscription on it, which have been removed. His accomplishments were desecrated, basically, and they sought to remove him. Now obviously we know of him because people still wrote about his life, but they really tried to eradicate his name. So this is really the second context, the second possible dating that the majority of scholars take. They believe that it was at this point that Domitian, that John was exiled to Patmos, and he has the vision, the revelation. Any other questions at this point in time? So dating the book of Revelation, this is a challenging thing to try and figure out. The reason why it's a challenging thing to figure out is that there is no smoking gun. despite the fact that, in spite of the fact that some scholars pitch their tent in different camps, there's no smoking gun when it comes to when it's written. Is it in the mid-60s or is it in the mid-90s? There's no smoking gun. Even the majority of scholars who date it in the mid-90s will acknowledge that there's really good arguments that the mid-60s people can make and vice versa. So there's no smoking gun. A lot of people would argue the question of why is it important? Why does it matter when it's written? And the reason is because the contents in the book of Revelation, when it was written, helps us determine how futuristic the events are. Are the majority of events in the book of Revelation, have they already come to pass, or are we still waiting for these events to come to pass? So if we assume that it's written in the mid-60s, then we would say that a lot of the chapters are devoted, sort of describing the destruction of the temple through this apocalyptic lens, this apocalyptic genre, and therefore we're really waiting on the end stuff, the second coming of Jesus and the new heavens and the new earth. If it's written in the time of Domitian, then there could be any number of things still to take place. And now I don't use, I draw on a lot of scholars, but I don't tend to cite a lot of them here. But I just want to cite two scholars here, two famous scholars. R.C. Sproul, who's quite an incredible theologian, says, if the book was written after AD 70, then its contents manifestly do not refer to the events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem. So what he's saying is that if the book of Revelation is in Domitian's time, then how we interpret these events is left to speculation and discussion. If it is written in before the destruction of the temple, then we know what a lot of these things refer to. Kenneth Gentry said that if the late date of around AD 95 to 96 is accepted, a wholly different situation would prevail. The events in the mid to late 60s of the first century would be absolutely excluded as possible fulfillments. In other words, the destruction of the temple is not how we interpret these events. The prophecies within Revelation would therefore be opened to an abundance of speculative scenarios which could be extrapolated into the indefinite future. So what he's saying is what I've just said there. If the books of Revelation is not talking about the destruction of the temple, then there are an abundance of speculative scenarios as to what this could be. The events in the book of Revelation could be talking about things which are still to come. The events in the book of Revelation could be talking about things which have been fulfilled at different points in history. We're open to a variety of speculation. And the one thing that I want to say is that one thing we've got to be careful of is that it's popular amongst a number of historians to date all of the books of the New Testament, including the book of Revelation, to be after 70 AD. The reason being is that because the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, a lot of scholars, what they do is they date Paul's letters, the epistles in the New Testament to, sometime between in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But they date the Gospels to after 70 AD. The reason being is that because the Gospels predict the destruction of the temple, some theologians and some scholars who reject the notion of prophecy, or some historians who don't believe in prophecy, will argue that, well, these books must have been written after the destruction of the temple because they speak about the destruction of the temple, right? So for this reason, many scholars, and they're not just non-Christian scholars, even Christian scholars who do believe in prophecy, and who do believe that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, some of them, will argue that it's post 70 AD simply because they don't believe in the nature of prophecy, or because, that is just what the popular views seem to take. But, we can debate all of these things. But originally, I used to fall into the majority category that the books of the New Testament were written after 70 AD. Now I fall into the belief that actually most likely, if we look at the internal evidence, I actually believe that most likely the books were written before 70 AD. And the reason is obvious, is that if you have Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple, then you would actually mention it in the Gospels. You would actually record his speech and you would say to the audience, by the way, these things actually happened. One thing that the New Testament does is every time something has already happened, they mention it in order to give credibility to Jesus. Yet Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John doesn't mention the Olivet Discourse. And I'm going to mention that why that's interesting in a second, is that All of them mention Jesus's prediction about the temple being destroyed, but none of them actually talk about that fulfillment, which you think is a bit strange. But anyway, that's for another day. So there is no smoking gun. There are a group of robust minority, some pretty significant scholars who date Revelation in the 60s, but the substantial majority do fall at the later date. I put that out there. There's a number of reasons for that. I'm not going to go, this table just lists some of these. I'm just going to scoot through these pretty quickly. If you look at the table, we see the early date, there are positive arguments and the counter arguments that can be made. The later date, here are the positive arguments, here are some of the counter arguments that can be made. If we look at the early date, well, as we read the passages in scripture in the book of Revelation itself, arguments, I should say, is important. Arguments for the dating of the book of Revelation really fall into two categories. Internal, so what markers in the book of Revelation, what internal markers can we see which might give us a clue as to the date that it was written? The second category of evidence is external markers. Is there external historical information, or are there external later authors who have made reference to the book of Revelation who mention the dating of the book of Revelation? Now, if we look at the early date, the internal evidence has a couple of interesting points. For one, there's repeated places which seem to indicate that these things are going to happen soon. I am coming soon, Jesus says. The time is near. There are all of these references to, as we looked at the addresses to the churches, it was all, the time is near. Be prepared. The time is near. I am coming soon. The revelation Jesus gave to John, showing him things which must soon take place. As Aris mentioned before, Revelation talks about the temple in Jerusalem. And we know it's talking about the temple in Jerusalem because it says, where also their Lord was crucified. So if the temple wasn't standing, why would you mention it in Revelation 11? 666 in Gematria, this refers to Nero. So it makes sense that they could be talking about Nero. The persecution in chapters 2 and 3, when we talk about when we looked at the letters to the seven churches, the two churches which are experiencing intense persecution are experiencing persecution not from the empire, but from the Jewish authorities, and it's referred to as the synagogue of Satan. So this reflects the earlier pre-Roman persecution. And another interesting point is the letter which is addressed to the church in Philadelphia. The church in Philadelphia is called Philadelphia. After the 80s, Philadelphia was renamed to Flavia. Now, if you were writing the letter during Domitian's time, you would typically address the letter to the church in Flavia, but it's used by its old name. Another interesting point that people make: if John had written the book of the book of Revelation during the 90s, well, John would have been pretty old at this point. He would have been in his 80s or in his 90s. Now, most people didn't live to that age, so that's another argument that people actually draw upon. The other thing which is interesting, this point is interesting, is that there's been some connections, some interesting connections which scholars have noted. They've drawn the dots between a reference that John gives in his gospel. In John chapter 5, verse 2, you remember John in chapter 5 is telling the story about how Jesus heals a man. Remember, the man is a paralyzed man, and Jesus comes to him and asks him if he wants to get well. And there is a pool which is called Bethsaida. And the paralyzed man says, I have nobody to help me into the water. And John tells him to get up and walk. Jesus tells the man to get up and walk, and he heals the man. Now, there's been an interesting connection made. If you notice in John's gospel, he introduces it where he says, now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethsaida, and which is surrounded by 5 colored colonnades. Now, the language that John seems to indicate is that this pool is there during the time of his writing. after the temple had been destroyed, large sections of the city, including this particular pool, had most likely been destroyed. So if John is writing his gospel, he could be writing his gospel earlier than historians have actually argued. Now, the reason why this is interesting is that there was this prologue to John's gospel, which is dating to about the 2nd century. Now, what's interesting about this fragment is often when they circulated the gospels, they would circulate a little bit of a prologue to some of the gospels, talking about authorship and dating and the like. What's interesting is that this prologue, which is from the 2nd century, makes reference to the fact that John writes the book of Revelation before he writes his gospel. Now, Clement of Alexandria tells us that John wrote his gospel at the urging of his friends whilst in Ephesus. What we know from church history is that John was exiled to Patmos. After his exile had finished, he was allowed to return to Patmos, and it's there that he writes his gospel whilst in Ephesus. So ipso facto, if the book of Revelation is written whilst he's in exile, then his gospel must have been written after the book of Revelation. So if the gospel is therefore written during an earlier period, then the book of Revelation must also be written during an earlier period, okay? One of the strongest arguments made about the dating of the book of Revelation, we're going to discuss when we look at chapter 17. Chapter 17 makes this point that it says there are 7 kings. It says 5 have fallen, 1 is. The other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain only a little while. Only a little while. So if we look back to our map, our list of Roman Caesars, if 5 have come and the 6th is currently there, Julius Caesar 1, Augustus 2, Tiberius 3, Caligula 4, Claudius 5, Nero 6. 5 have fallen, 1 is. 1 is yet to come, who would be Galba, and then obviously we're going to lead to the destruction of the temple. So that's probably this argument here about Revelation chapter verse 17, which talks about the 7 kings, is probably one of the most famous arguments for why people have taken the early date. But look, there are a list of counter arguments there that one could make. So there are just a list of counter arguments. So for instance, when we talk about why does Revelation 11 talk about the temple in Jerusalem? Well, this is a visionary experience. So it doesn't necessarily need the temple to be standing for John to still be given an experience of the temple. The words, as we looked at in the first week when we talked about the soonness of Jesus returning, the soonness, although it refers to something that's going to happen immediately, it can also mean just something that's going to happen without any sort of hindrance to God's plan, as in God's plans are soon and near, in the sense that there's nothing that can actually stop them. So there's a whole lot of list of counter arguments that could actually be made. For instance, the question about why it's called Philadelphia and not Flavia. Yes, the name had actually changed in the mid-'80s to Flavia, but some people during the mid-'90s, people really disliked Domitian in Philadelphia. So it's possible that John is being a bit creative by referring to it by its old name rather than the name of the emperor who it hated. There's just a whole lot of counter arguments which could be made. The listing of the kings, the 5 kings, there are 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is. You could divide the list a number of different ways to come to whatever conclusion you want. John's age, yes, if Revelation does come in the mid-'90s, yes, John would have been really old, but so what? People did live into old age at this time. Clement of Alexandria tells us that John lives into old age. Eusebius tells us this as well. The main argument, there are a number of arguments for both, and I'm not listed all the arguments for both. But the main argument that's been given for the later date, and this is why the majority of scholars fall into this position, is actually Irenaeus. Irenaeus, who's writing in the 2nd century, is the closest church father that we have to the actual timing of the book of Revelation. And he's commenting on the Antichrist. He's commenting on the Antichrist, and he says, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the nature of the Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctively revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision." So all he's saying here is that if we needed to know the name of the Antichrist, if we needed to know the name of the beast, John would have told us the name of the beast. And he goes on to say that for that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day toward the end of Domitian's reign. So what he's basically saying here, it's a very odd choice of words that he uses, and I wish he had been a bit clearer, but all he's basically saying to his audience here is that the events of the book of Revelation were written very close to our time. And whose reign was very close to our time? Well, he mentions Domitian's reign. So most scholars seem to take Irenaeus's statement, and then they actually argue that for this reason, it's the later date. It's the later date. It's during the time of Domitian. A number of look, these are really complex arguments. A number of church fathers, Tertullian, Clement, Jerome, Eusebius, they sort of uphold. Scholars have pieced together a number of things that they've said and sort of said that they uphold Irenaeus's testimony. But the main argument is this argument that Irenaeus makes about the fact that John sees the vision during Domitian's reign. The counter argument to be made here, and this I think is important, is that Irenaeus's argument is not actually clear. When you read his statement in the Greek, at best you can say, yes, he does seem to be indicating Domitian, but you can't say it with any certainty. But when you read it in the Greek, it's quite obscure what he's saying. He could also be saying that we saw John during the time of Domitian's reign. So on the one hand, what some people, the majority think he's saying is that John had the vision during the time of Domitian, but it is possible that the Greek wording actually means that what Irenaeus is saying is that we saw John recently, which was during the time of Domitian's reign. So we know John lived into old age. So does that make sense? Is that actually clear to everyone what I'm saying there? The Greek is not clear, and you can read it one or two ways. Irenaeus could be saying that John had his revelation, where it says, for that which was seen no very long time ago, but almost in our day toward the end of Domitian's reign. He could be saying that it was the apocalyptic vision, the book of Revelation, which was seen not that long ago during the time of Domitian. But he also could be saying that it was John himself who was not yet seen that long ago. Does that make sense? Now, like I said, there are commentators on both sides of the argument. There are a robust minority who take the early date. There are a whole lot of respectable scholars who take the majority view. Okay, there is no smoking gun. Even the most staunch campaigners for both dates will argue passionately about their view, but will acknowledge that there is merit to the other side as well. One of my favorite commentators, a historian by the name of Craig Keener, I had the privilege of meeting him. He takes the majority view, but even he acknowledges that this is not a hill we can die on. There's good reasons to believe both. There's good reasons why a person can robustly argue the counter, the early date, and it's just hard to say. Now, a few weeks ago, when I spoke about the introduction to the book of Revelation, I sort of underscored the importance of this question. You know, that point I made earlier, that when we date it, really impacts how futuristic these events are, and where these events have been fulfilled in human history. And I need to apologize for that, because I actually think that the dating does matter. I never intended to do so much work on the setting on the book of Revelation, because on these questions about Nero, Domitian, and the dating. But the more I've studied the book of Revelation, the more, in order to prepare for this class, the more I've realized that it is a really important question. because obviously where you date the book impacts how you interpret the book. And for this reason, I want to say that everyone knows what this picture is. This is the lower house in Australian Parliament. Now we know that in Australian Parliament, there are 150 seats. To get the majority, you need half of 150 plus one. So if there's 150 seats in Parliament, you divide that by 2, you need 75 plus 1 to have the majority, 76, right? Now, that's the composition of Australian Parliament, right? Now, if we were having this discussion about a month ago when I was first doing the introduction, or about 6 weeks ago, I would have said that the majority camp is the government. The majority camp, the majority camp where most scholars fall, is quite a significant majority. They've got a good majority in the House, right? There's the minority, which is quite a vocal minority, but they're definitely the minority. I'm in the crossbench. I appreciate both arguments. I lean towards the majority view. What I would say now is that I have shifted allegiance to the opposition. I've shifted allegiance to the minority view, but I'm one of those odd people who don't always toe the party line, and I'm at risk of being expelled into the crossbench at any time, or back to being an independent, if that makes sense. So I do lean towards the minority view. Okay, I have tremendous respect for those who are in the majority view. I have changed my position. So from this point forward, I will be teaching, and I'll be giving a credible message to both, right? The dating does and doesn't matter, right? But I'll be giving a pretty fair treatment of the book of Revelation from this point in, but I will be acknowledging that I'm in the opposition. I'm not making a political commentary at this point. I'm not talking about Labor and Liberal. This was just the best analogy I could use. Thanks, Mum. This was the best analogy and the best picture that I could get, which communicates this point. You know, on election night, when they are giving their election campaign and they have the colorful squares and the like, right? I tried to find a neutral one of those to indicate. I can't, right? Okay. This is just for the sake of the argument, all right? So on this particular point, is that any questions or any comments that anybody wants to make? Okay, just quickly to sort of wrap this part of the conversation up. Nero on the left-hand picture, the Temple of Jerusalem in the middle. We've got Domitian there in the top corner on the right, and at the bottom is Trajan, an emperor who's going to come later. I think that no matter which position you take on the book of Revelation, I think you can actually come to the same sort of interpretation. The reason why is I think if we take the early date, then we can say that the book of Revelation is looking forward to the destruction of the temple and to the eventual return of Christ and the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. Okay? I think if we take the later date, then what we can say, however, is that it is still possible that the book of Revelation is talking about the destruction of the temple. What it could be doing is it could be looking back in order to look forward. So what I mean by this is that what could be happening is that the book of Revelation looks back to if it's written during the time of Domitian. Domitian had set himself up as God on earth. What the book of Revelation could be doing is looking back to the beast, Nero 666, and casting Domitian as a new persecutor of God's people, and looking back to the destruction of the temple, these horrific events, to reassure God's people through the lens of apocalyptic literature that don't worry, God is building a new temple. And the culmination of this new temple is you and the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. Now, during Trajan's reign, persecution of Christians picked up. Nero's reign, intense persecution, brief, intense persecution of Christians. Period of peace. After the destruction of the temple, after the time of Nero, Christians enjoyed quite a bit of a golden age, a bit of prosperity. There's a bit of stability, not as many problems for them. Domitian comes all of a sudden, sets himself up as God on earth, brief but severe persecution of Christians. He finishes off a period of peace. Maybe John was exiled and banished during the time of Domitian's reign. Domitian was known to banish people, to exile people. He exiled a lot of people, right? John could have been one of these people during this reign who had a governor exile him. He could have been exiled during the time of Nero. Exile was a common punishment throughout different parts of Roman history. But maybe if the revelation of John happens during Domitian's reign, John is exiled during the time of Domitian's reign, not by Domitian personally, but by some, governor. After Domitian's reign, just like the senators start to come back into power, those who had been banished were allowed to return. Maybe that happened. So what I'm saying is this, is that if the book of Revelation was written during Domitian's time, if this is when John has the apocalypse, maybe what God is reassuring his people in Asia Minor is this, is that let's look back to a significant event in order to encourage people, God's people, that God is doing something new and building a new temple. So I still think that we can come to pretty similar interpretations of the book of Revelation, whichever way we go. And the example I'll use is this, right? The New Testament, when it's constructing the life of Jesus, it looks back in order to look forward. It documents Jesus's life through the lens of the Old Testament, through the lens of the book of Exodus, that just like in the Old Testament, Moses led God's people led God's people out of bondage and was the lawgiver. Jesus is the new lawgiver, and he's leading people out of the bondage of sin for eternal life. So what the book of Revelation could be doing is, if it's an apocalypse which has happened in the later date, what it could be saying is that God could be getting his people to look back in their not too distant past in order to look forward. Hey guys, remember what happened recently when the temple was destroyed? Let me reassure you, I'm building a new temple. I'm building a new temple. And even though you're going to experience more persecution to come, just like you experienced persecution in Nero's day, just like you're experiencing persecution now at Domitian, that persecution is going to continue. But for those who hold fast, I'm going to give you the victor's crown. Does that make sense? Even though I take the early date that it's in Nero's time, it's positioning the destruction of the temple in apocalyptic literature. I still think that even if you want to pitch your tent in the secondary camp, the majority camp, all God is doing is getting his people to look back in order to look forward. Look back at the old temple in order to look forward at the new temple, which is being created in Christ, which is about people, not a building. Okay, now I just want to finish up now with just something really, really simple and really quick, more so a picture to help you to understand. The purpose of the book of Revelation, the central theme, I believe, of the book of Revelation, as I've told you before, is to communicate the victory of God, the victory of Christ. And what this book is telling us is that God is creating a new temple. What is the book of Revelation moving towards? The book of Revelation is moving towards the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. It ends with John having this wonderful vision of a new temple, the golden city coming down out of heaven, like a bride beautifully adorned for his church. Christ comes. Sorry, we are the bride beautifully adorned, beautifully dressed for Christ. That's where the book of Revelation is heading. So what the central theme of the book of Revelation is to reassure God's people that even though they're experiencing persecution at the hands of local authorities and authorities in the empire, God is building his new temple. We're moving towards a new temple and the Bible, it's building on the Gospels. Jesus is victorious. The new temple is us. The new heavens and the new earth is what God is creating. So I want to reassure you that no matter how we interpret the book of Revelation, we've got to remember that is the central theme. Now, there have been different approaches taken to the book of Revelation, 4 main approaches. there is the preterist approach. You're going to find that I tend to fall mostly into that category. The preterist approach believes that the majority of things in the book of Revelation happened in the first century, right? And what is left to come is basically the back end of these chapters. You know, basically the creation, the final few chapters, the creation of the new heavens and the new earth, right? That's the preterist approach, basically. The historicist approach believes, the futurist approach we'll do next is basically the opposite of the preterist approach, where the preterist approach says that everything happened, or the majority of stuff happened in the first century. The futurist approach says maybe a few things happened in the first century, but most of the things are still to happen, right? This is the view that tends to be the popular view, you know, in pop culture, that what we were talking about, where people tend to interpret a lot of crazy, you know, signs and symbols, you know, basically contemporary political events. Things are still to happen, right? The historicist approach is the approach which says that these things are happening throughout the last 2,000 years. Some things happened in the first century. Things have happened. The book of Revelation is talking about, the book of Revelation is a timeline. Things are being fulfilled across the board. You know, some of the things they would say were fulfilled during the Protestant Reformation, and maybe they would say that the harlot city was really the Roman Catholic Church, right? That's what they would say. You know, that there has been different, that it's really been fulfilled right throughout. The idealist approach tends to be the approach which says that these things happen in stages. That when you take the themes out of the book of Revelation, it goes through cycles. A whole lot of stuff is fulfilled, was started in the first century. These events are being fulfilled, again, through different series. It's like a washing machine, they would say. The book of Revelation cycles, and it repeats its cycles. So it's telling a story which is happening repetitively throughout Christian history of the last 2,000 years. So it first found fulfillment in the first century, and it's found fulfillment throughout different parts of the Christian era, you know, and it's just a cycle of things that have happened. And they tend to interpret the things in Revelation more symbolically. Like, remember we mentioned when we talked about the churches, how people tend to interpret the churches as different eras of church history. It's that sort of approach. So this next picture will probably help you try to memorize these particular points, because I think if you memorize these particular views, it'll help you actually see where a lot of people are at. So the preterist view, if you imagine the timeline, this is the cross and this is the return of Jesus. The preterist would say that the stuff happened in the first century. Some preterists are what are known as full preterists. They believe everything happened in the first century, right? Although I take the preterist approach, I don't take the full preterist approach, because I believe, there's stuff still to happen. The second coming of Jesus and the construction, the new temple, the new heavens and the new earth. So, but the preterist would say, yeah, stuff happened in the first century. The futurist, this is the stuff that happens, that's still to happen. This is what we hear in pop culture. Oh, you know, the return of people to the Jews to the promised land. You know, this politician, this thing, that event, these wars, these rumors of wars, this COVID-19. The historicist view, things have been happening right throughout. Yeah, the early chapters were in the first century. Maybe the middle chapters were in the Middle Ages. Maybe these chapters were in the Protestant Reformation. Maybe this era was during the time of the Great Christian Mission, during the 18th century. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff which is going to happen now as well. The idealist, splattered throughout. The book of Revelation is just telling the story of human existence, and it's just repeating itself. It's the same story happening over and over again. There are many antichrists. There are many beasts which are just coming over and over again in different times of human history. I think that all of these views have some merit. I'll be honest with you, all have some merit, and we really are taking a more elastic approach. We're not really falling into one viewpoint over another. But the viewpoint that I want to come back to is what I said at the start, that we don't want to interpret the details in the book of Revelation, the signs and symbols, any other way than the early church would have understood them. So these signs and symbols, what did they mean to the first century? What did they mean to those people then? And we'll continue with that same platform, that same ideology. What did these things mean to the early people? And I think the conclusion I've come to is that the majority of things in the book of Revelation were written to give hope to the people at that time, written to help encourage them around the events that were happening in the first century, the persecution that was happening in the first century, the destruction of the temple which happened in the first century. But there are still things in the book of Revelation, the later chapters, which are still to come. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with it. You can fall into whatever category you want. You can spread yourself across the board here.